As Cheryl said, there's a short bio of Marion, for those who don't know her, who I presume will be a minority. Marion is a legend in Cape Town and in medical circles, and she and William have known each other for a long time, and she will tell you about that. Marion?
I love the transformative action of having a height-adjusted mic. It's not my usual experience. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the University of KwaZulu-Natal for inviting me to be here. I find myself this morning stuck between psychologists, sociologists, historians, political scientists. So I'm talking as a former baby doctor. But I also want to say to the new Vice-Chancellor, this is my first time on this campus. In the 70s, 60s, when I was a medical student, I came to the institution which was then called UNNE, and then became UNB, which was the medical campus. And we didn't come to the University of Natal, Durban as it was called then, so thank you for inviting me here. And to Eddie Webster, if you think emeritus is aging in your discipline, it's not so in mine. We're much younger when we are appointed as emeritus professors. So, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But let me just say that the first time I witnessed Professor Makgoba delivering a lecture at an international research conference, I was absolutely astounded. This scientist, medical scientist, who had such a huge international reputation, was using only 2 slides. So this for me was transformative. Because as everybody knows, the greater your reputation as a medical scientist, the more PowerPoint slides you use. 1 for each molecule, follicle, and little toe. So in that spirit of using a minimal number of slides, if any, I'm also only just going to use 1 slide today to give you a visual impression of change at the Medical Research Council from the late 1960s to the Makgoba years, and also as an introduction to my relationship with the man of the match. So let me just find that. This is full screen. So, if you look on the left, the black and white picture, you'll see the photograph of the middle part of the first MRC board in 1969. All of them pale males. And then if you fast forward to our board in 1999, which is in glorious Technicolor, you can see me sitting between the 2 boys, Willie and Wally. On my left is Willie, or Professor Melegapuru Makgoba, the president, who was my predecessor as chair of the board. And on my right, Wally, or Professor Walter Brzezinski, who was the former president, who I have to say, when I spoke to him recently, he says he continues to have great respect for your term as head, Melegapuru, as head of one of the strongest science councils in the country, and he recalls his experience of you over many years as a leading international scientist of great repute. And I think many of us share that. But I love anecdotes, and here in a foretaste of what was to come, and in a way also reflective of what Eddie was challenging us to do, is what Wally recalls from an early conversation with Willie. And on inquiring from him where he comes from, Melegapuru answered, I am Makgoba. So of course I come from Makgoba's Kloof. And that's where you bloody Boere shot my grandfather. So Wally sympathized for the passing away of his grandpa. He apologized for what his forefathers had done, he said. But he suggested that perhaps those times were now past and we'd entered a new era. And so that takes me to the actual focus of what you've asked me to talk about, the era of transformation in the Medical Research Council from the period of 1995 to 2002, which I've called the Makgoba years, with him as chair of the first truly rainbow board in the early part of that period and as president for the last 5 years of his time there. So if you Google transformation, there's been a lot of talk this morning about what is transformation and what it isn't. And if you Google it, you get 260 million entries in 24 seconds. From mathematical matrix transformation, and I'm delighted that a couple of mathematicians will follow me, and to something called the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, which appears to be a quantitative measure of political transformation. And I hope Professor Katu will help us with that. But in our country, it is the process of social transformation that actually we grapple with most. And Russell has spoken to that, the change in our society's systemic characteristics. And it includes the technological, the economical, social, political, and cultural restructuring. And our major challenge is redress. So there are many stories to be told about the range of aspects of transformation at the MRC of those years, including transformation of the organization and its research agenda. So allow me to share just some of these with you through a wider lens. The transformation of the MRC's research mission actually started in the late 1960s with the publication of the MRC Act. And it signaled a movement from a curiosity-driven institution focused largely on diseases of the rich, which had been its major focus in the early years, to its new stated major function, which was embodied in the legislation, and I quote, to promote the improvement of the health and quality of life of the population of the Republic. But we all know there's a huge gap between good intentions like that and actual practice. And it took 20 years until Wally Makgoba was appointed as president in 1992 for someone to actually embark on the actual implementation of this intent. So we looked at essential and strategic health research programs that were initiated, and there was now a focus on the actual health problems of the burden of disease on the majority of the population, and an effort to align the pace and nature of change at the MRC with what was happening in the country. And under Brzezinski, the MRC also introduced what was then called affirmative action. And the first 3 years of his presidency were marked by this new shift in doing business. And then the new board arrived in 1995. And under Makgoba, as chair of the board and later president, the mild winds of change that Wally Makgoba had initiated turned into a tornado, heralding the start of a revitalized and transformed MRC, which was going to attain a leading position in the national science and health systems. This was the first science council in the country to be governed by a board described as fully representative and restructured. There were only 3 of the original board members in the new board of 17 that were left. And the newly appointed chair was Professor Makgoba, with Professor Brzezinski staying as president. The new board was charged with the science and health mandates of the new order. And while there were scientists and health professionals, members of other related professions like finance and law, and representatives of civil society on the board, by my recollection, not one of us, not even the 3 remaining members of the old board, had experience in exercising fiduciary responsibilities demanded of a science council, or for that matter, chairing one, as was the lot of Professor Makgoba here. I recall climbing the stairs to that boardroom on our first meeting, with the walls of the stairwell adorned with the photographs of previous boards, and wondering what awaited us upstairs. Not only was the huge boardroom arranged around a central area which to me looked scarily coffin-shaped actually. But we were also told of many stories of the old MRC and its board, its functioning, the communication between the boardroom and the president's office, and also things that were found in the safe during your time. A cache of guns that were to be used by snipers on the roof of the MRC, just in case this bastion of research was attacked by insurgents from the local community of Ravensmead, which is a sub-economic area. We could have been afraid. In fact, we could have been very afraid. But we were confident that our leader was fantastic. He dazzled us with his knowledge of science and its management. But at the same time, at his first meeting, he secretly shared with Wally Prozeski that he'd not had to chair a meeting like this before. And he asked him to please sit next to him and pass him little notes about what he was meant to be doing. He boldly stated that we needed to remember that the money for which we had responsibility, and I think it was about 72 million, was sacred and shouldn't be used inappropriately. And I think that that was one of the mantras of his transformative leadership, and one that led to us receiving year on year clean audits, even though when we had arrived there, few if any of us had knowledge of King's guidance on good corporate governance, nor did we know about this thing called the PFMA, which we could recite by the time we had left. In Dr. Makgoba's first annual report as chair of the board in March 1996, he recalled that at the first meeting of the new transformed board, we had all welcomed the opportunity to guide the restructuring and redefinition of the MRC, and that a major task was to develop the highest quality of human capacity in health and medical research. A process of corporate planning focused on strategy implementation, regular assessments of progress and revision, and a progressive employment policy with an intent to make sure that all the vacant posts at the MRC at that time, 75% of them were to be black people were to be appointed against those jobs. In 1997, there was a review by an international panel commissioned by the Department then of Arts, Culture, Science and Tech. It was called the SETI Review, and its report was that during the previous 3 years, the MRC had undergone significant transformation, and I quote, in line with the national objectives of the new South Africa. And they stated that the Medical Research Council is a national asset which is being successfully transformed to discharge its responsibilities and functions. This partnership of Willie and Wally worked very well. Willie as the chair and Wally as the president. And on Wally's voluntary retirement in 1998, based on his recognition that the MRC needed a new president for the new order, Minister Dlamini Zuma noted the success of the partnership, and while attributing it to the fact that both of these men were committed to the national project, commended Wally for being a true South African patriot, if you recall that. The Prozeski years had paved the way for renewed leadership and accelerating in the pace of change, and in September 1998, the journal Nature heralded the appointment of Melegapuru Makgoba as president of the MRC with the heading Controversial Appointment to a South African Council. Describing his experience as a research professor at Wits as his having been, and I quote, at the center of a controversy, the article also stated, and again I quote, Makgoba's appointment at the MRC was unusual since he was chair of the MRC board. He resigned from this post after applying to be MRC president. The selection process was conducted by the deputy chair of the MRC board, Marion Jacobs, who succeeds Makgoba as chair. So 17 years later, allow me to set the record straight. And while this may have been perceived as being unusual, I think it was one example of good corporate governance at its best. This was yet another example of organizational transformation, and a period during which, as the now retired chair of the board and an applicant for the presidency, our relationship changed. He truly showed his mettle as a leader. In this different role, he was absolutely disciplined in this new relationship with me, showing integrity of character and professionalism of the highest order, while I, along with the board and members of the selection committee, were furiously studying King, industrial relations law, looking for other organizational precedents to make sure that we did things right. In the end, we all came out on top. Us, as the MRC, being recognized for setting a new level of quality in the governance process, and him being unanimously approved for appointment as president after a really grueling process. This included documentation, record review, interviews, as well as traveling the country to all the big centers where the shortlisted candidates had to present their vision and be challenged as they presented this by colleagues and interested parties. And we traveled from Pretoria to Durban to Bloemfontein, and for him, all the time with no PowerPoint slides, he managed to convince people just by his power of oratory, if I can say so. In his first presidential report, he enumerated some of the council's achievements, and he also noted that the MRC mission to promote equity and development in its employment policy had resulted in significant change in the demographic profile of the organization. He also set out the goals for a changed MRC, in short, from one driven to achieve science output to one driven to achieve a higher standard of national health. Now, on his appointment, he had stated his priorities for his term as president in words that had never been in the lexicon of MRC presidential language before. He spoke about improving social cohesion, building capacity, promoting interdisciplinary research. And with these priorities as drivers, one of the major focal areas of his term was his involvement in developing South Africa's AIDS strategy and the South African AIDS Vaccine Initiative, or SAVI, which was a lead program at the MRC, aiming to find an affordable, effective, and locally relevant HIV vaccine. So here comes the next transformative step. Recognizing that SAVI needed the best director who would ensure the kind of success which would have a critical and significant impact on those who bear the burden of HIV infection, he decided to make an appointment of the best person, irrespective of creed or color. And he did just that. And in a shift of roles, Willie appointed Wally, who was an internationally recognized virologist and leader in his field, as the first director. During this same period, President Mbeki invited several HIV/AIDS denialists to join his presidential advisory board. And this resulted in government policies that had wide-ranging impact on the lives of thousands of South Africans, about which we all know. Engaging with this reality and taking a stand against what he termed as pseudoscience demanded courage and scientific integrity. And it particularly demanded courage because he was taking a stand against somebody who was his friend, who had written the foreword to his book, and who was his president. Fearlessly, he led the fight against AIDS denialism and the right for the freedom of scientific inquiry. He was the signatory and co-editor of the Durban Declaration on HIV and AIDS, which affirmed the scientific consensus that HIV causes AIDS. And this document was signed by over 5,000 people, including Nobel Prize winners and directors of leading research bodies across the world. But his stand for transformation of science and its management wasn't restricted to South Africa. And along with Tim Tucker, in a hard-hitting paper entitled Private-Public Partnerships and Scientific Imperialism, which was published in Science in 2008, they demonstrated the almost negligible participation of the Global South in the governance of private-public partnerships, which purported to have concern for addressing diseases of the Global South and its related inequity in health. Using the participation of Africans in the structures of governance of these global organizations as proxy measures, they noted that the current then PPPO paradigm is, and I quote, fundamentally neocolonial in structure and operation, and warned, and I quote again, that those who fund and control PPPOs need to revisit and address the ways in which they operate, including their structures, personnel, and systems, so that Africans will not remain relatively disempowered participants. And I would suggest that that paper be resuscitated, because not much has changed globally. So through the wider lens of transformation, there was much change in the agenda, focus, and management of the MRC's science, its programs, not only its people and its demographic profile during his term. And the influence of this wide-ranging transformation wasn't only felt in the health and science systems of our country, but also extended way beyond our borders. Back at the MRC, the president gave strong support to strong science. And the director of the Cochrane Center notes that these were the early days of systematic reviews and meta-analysis in South Africa. And so not many people really understood what we are on about. And Jimmy goes on and says, so his insight and support were pivotal in providing the cover we needed to survive and grow. And again, at the MRC, under his leadership, this new order also extended to a more equitable distribution of intra- and extramural research units, as well as a single measure for assessing productivity of both the internal and extramural units. A research leader who is still at the MRC recalls, and I quote him, as far as I know, Professor Makgoba was the first MRC president to take a good look at the lifetime publication outputs of the intramural unit directors, and some were challenged for not having published enough. I remember those times well. This sent ripples through the MRC and had a big impact on the future outputs of intramural research units. So very importantly, these changes in the management of the science were also accompanied by other radical changes in the way in which the business was conducted, which took the MRC to an entirely different level of effectiveness, culminating in a doubling of the budget of almost 200 million for 2000-2001, which in 2015 years, I guess, sounds like a pittance, but there was a lot of money then. By the time Melegapuru left the MRC in 2002 for the greener pastures of this institution, the MRC had undergone 2 SETI reviews and had not been found wanting. On the contrary, he left the organization in a healthier state than it ever had been. The MRC had been reinstated in the galaxy of global health research bodies, while its agenda was firmly aligned with the national need and the national project. And as the mathematicians would say, quaerat demonstrandum, or QED. Transformational leadership is a style of leadership where the leader is charged with identifying the needed change, creating a vision to guide the change through inspiration, and executing the change in tandem with committed members of the group. And I believe there can be no doubt that Melegapuru Makgoba's leadership transformed the MRC and the national science agenda in ways that have been phenomenal. And I think that the new Vice-Chancellor will agree with me. But transformational leadership also serves to enhance the motivation, morale, and job performance of followers through a variety of mechanisms, which I'm sure you've experienced here. These include being a role model for followers